3 days later, Sergeant David Reynolds stood in the medical bay of the Earth Alliance cruiser Horizon, looking remarkably well for someone who had spent weeks in Vorthon detention. The bruises on his face were healing, and the medics had already cleared him for duty, but Captain Marcus could see the deeper wounds in the young man's eyes. They kept asking about our military capabilities, Reynolds reported, his voice steady despite everything he had endured. Fleet strength, weapon systems, defensive installations. They seemed genuinely confused when I told them we didn't have any secret superweapons hidden away. Marcus nodded, making notes on his tablet while trying to process everything that had happened since that extraordinary scene in the Galactic Council chamber. The woman, who had never given her name, had simply vanished after the various ambassadors had made their commitments. No dramatic exit, no final warnings. One moment she was there, the next she was gone, leaving behind only the lingering sense that the galaxy had fundamentally changed. The strange thing was, Reynolds continued, toward the end of my captivity, the guards started treating me differently. Not better exactly, but carefully, like they were afraid of what might happen if they hurt me. They were right to be afraid, Marcus said quietly, thinking of the terror he had witnessed in Ambassador Zethkar's eyes. David, there are some things you need to know about what happened while you were gone. He spent the next hour explaining the encounter with humanity's guardian, watching Reynolds' expression shift from disbelief to wonder, to a kind of awed understanding. When he finished, the young sergeant sat in silence for several minutes, processing the implications. So we're not alone, Reynolds finally said. Humanity has protectors? Apparently we always have, Marcus replied. We just forgot about them. Or maybe they wanted us to forget so we could develop naturally. Reynolds stood and walked to the viewport, staring out at the stars with new eyes. It explains a lot, doesn't it? Why we've always felt like we belonged out here, even when other species treated us like primitives. Why we keep pushing forward despite the odds. Marcus joined him at the viewport. The question now is what we do with this knowledge. Do we tell Earth? Do we keep it secret? Do we change how we interact with other species? The woman said we were already becoming what they hoped we would become, Reynolds said thoughtfully. Maybe we don't need to change anything. Maybe we just need to keep being ourselves, but with more confidence. Their conversation was interrupted by an urgent chime from the ship's communication system. Captain Chen to the bridge, came the voice of Commander Sarah Walsh. Priority transmission from the Galactic Council. Marcus and Reynolds exchanged glances before heading to the bridge. They found Commander Walsh standing before the main view screen, her expression carefully neutral. Sir, you need to see this. The screen activated to show the Galactic Council chamber, but it looked very different from the scene 3 days ago. Instead of the usual chaotic babel of competing voices, the delegates sat in respectful silence as Ambassador Zethkar addressed the assembly. The Vorthon Empire formally apologizes to the human delegation and the families of those lost in our unprovoked attack on the Proxima Centauri mining station, the Vorthon was saying, his voice carrying none of its former arrogance. We will provide full reparations and accept whatever additional penalties the Council deems appropriate. Marcus felt his jaw drop. In the 3 years since humanity had joined the galactic community, he had never seen a major power voluntarily accept responsibility for aggressive action, let alone offer reparations without being forced to do so. But Zethkar wasn't finished. Furthermore, the Vorthon Empire is announcing a fundamental shift in our expansion policies. Effective immediately, we will be redirecting our military forces from conquest operations to peacekeeping duties. We will work with the Galactic Council to identify regions where our strength can be used to protect developing civilizations rather than exploit them. The camera panned across the chamber, showing delegates from dozens of species listening with expressions of amazement. The Hive Queen's antennae were perfectly still, a sign of intense concentration in her species. The Aquatic Federation representatives were singing harmony beneath the main proceedings, their translator indicating songs of gratitude and hope. Similar announcements have been coming in all morning, Commander Walsh explained quietly. The Hegemony Coalition has declared a moratorium on territorial expansion. The Predator Alliance has released all their indentured servants and is offering citizenship to former slave species. It's like the entire galaxy has gone insane. Not insane, Marcus corrected, thinking of ancient eyes that held the wisdom of ages. Sane. Maybe for the first time in millennia. The transmission continued with smaller powers following the lead of the major civilizations. Trade agreements were being renegotiated to ensure fair terms for developing worlds. Military alliances were being restructured around mutual defense rather than aggressive expansion. Research partnerships were being formed to share technology freely rather than hoarding it for competitive advantage. Sergeant Reynolds watched the proceedings with growing amazement. They're all afraid, he realized. Every single one of them is terrified of what might happen if they don't change their ways. Can you blame them? Marcus asked. They just learned that their actions are being watched by beings who have the power to erase entire civilizations from existence. But they're not doing it out of fear alone, Commander Walsh observed, pointing to the screen where the crystalline collective was resonating with harmonic frequencies that indicated genuine joy. Look at some of the smaller species. They're celebrating. This is what they've wanted all along, a galaxy where cooperation matters more than conquest. Marcus nodded, beginning to understand the true genius of what humanity's guardians had accomplished. They hadn't needed to destroy anyone or impose their will through force. They had simply reminded the galaxy's powers that their actions had consequences, and that those consequences would be determined by beings who valued justice over strength. The question is whether it will last, Reynolds said pragmatically. Fear is a powerful motivator, but it fades with time. Will they remember this lesson in 100 years? 1,000? They will if we help them remember, Marcus said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. Maybe that's humanity's real role in all this. Not to be the guardians ourselves, but to be the conscience of the galaxy. To remind everyone what we're all supposed to be working toward. The transmission ended with the announcement of a new galactic cooperation initiative, a voluntary framework for peaceful development and mutual assistance that every major power had already agreed to join. It was a complete transformation of galactic politics accomplished in less than a week. Marcus looked around the bridge at his crew, seeing his own sense of wonder reflected in their faces. Humanity had entered the galactic community as struggling newcomers, barely tolerated by the established powers. Now they found themselves at the center of a fundamental transformation, representatives of an ancient legacy they were only beginning to understand. Set course for Earth, he ordered. I think it's time we had a very interesting conversation with Earth Command. The Aquatic Federation's representative suddenly activated his suit's communication system, his gills working frantically as he spoke in rapid, bubbling tones. The translation came through as urgent whispers. The deep archives. We have records. Songs from the abyssal trenches speak of the time before, when gods walked between worlds and judged the worthiness of nations. The woman turned toward the aquatic delegate with interest. Your people remember, she observed with approval. The songs of the deep dwellers have always been more reliable than the written histories of surface worlds. We remember the compact, the aquatic being continued, his tone taking on the reverence usually reserved for religious ceremonies. The ancient agreement between the elder race and the galaxy's children. But we thought. We hoped. The time of judgment was past. So did we. The woman replied sadly. We hoped you had all learned to be better than your ancestors. Some of you have. Her gaze swept across several delegations with what might have been approval. The crystalline collective has spent the last 1,000 years helping to terraform dead worlds. The nebula beings have shared their atmospheric processing technology freely, with any species that needed it. She paused beside the insectoid hive queen, whose antennae were twitching with barely controlled anxiety. Your people have maintained perfect ecological balance on every world they've colonized, proving that expansion doesn't have to mean destruction. The praise seemed to calm some of the more peaceful species. But Marcus noticed that the predatory civilizations were becoming increasingly agitated. The implications were clear. Some would be judged favorably and others would not. But others have chosen a different path. The woman continued, her attention returning to the Vorthan delegation. The hegemony wars of the past century, the systematic exploitation of the Outer Rim territories, the trafficking of sentient beings through supposedly legal channels. Ambassador Zethkar's scales began rattling again. Those were legitimate military actions, he protested weakly. Expansion is the right of any sufficiently advanced civilization. According to whose law? The woman asked mildly. The strong have always made rules that benefit themselves and called it justice. But there are older laws than the ones written in your legal codes. She raised her hand, and Marcus felt the air in the chamber shift in ways that his instruments couldn't measure, but his nervous system definitely detected. The law that says technological advancement must serve life, not death. The law that says strength exists to protect the weak, not exploit them. The law that says every sentient being has the right to grow and develop without fear of being crushed by those who happen to evolve faster. Captain, Marcus found himself standing without consciously deciding to do so. What happens now? He asked, speaking for all the human delegates. If your people are awakening, what does that mean for Earth? For humanity's place in the galaxy? The woman's expression grew warm as she looked at him. That depends on what humanity chooses to become, she said. You've done well so far. Better than we dared hope in many ways. You've faced discrimination and threats with dignity. You've sought peaceful solutions even when violence might have been easier. You've shown compassion for species very different from yourselves. She gestured around the chamber. Look at this moment. Your species has just been revealed as the descendants of the galaxy's most feared guardians. And your first question isn't about what power this gives you. It's about what responsibilities come with it. Marcus felt a flush of pride but also a weight of expectation settling on his shoulders. Are we expected to become like you? To judge other civilizations? Not judge, the woman corrected. Guide. Protect. Serve as an example of what strength with wisdom looks like. She smiled, and for a moment she looked less like an ancient guardian and more like a proud mother. You already are in many ways. The question is whether you're ready to do it on a larger scale. The Hive Queen's chittering took on an urgent tone. The others, she managed to communicate. How many of the old ones still sleep? How many are awakening? Enough, came the simple reply. We never needed many. Quality over quantity was always our approach. The woman's expression grew serious. But we're hoping we won't need to act directly. The galaxy has had 30,000 years to learn from its mistakes. We'd prefer to see those lessons finally take hold. Ambassador Zethkar struggled to his feet again, his movements careful and deliberate. The sergeant, he said, I will personally ensure his immediate release, and I will recommend to the High Command that we reconsider our expansion policies. Recommend? The woman asked, her eyebrow rising slightly. I will ensure, Zethkar corrected hastily. The Vorthan Empire will undergo the changes you've suggested. We will become protectors instead of conquerors. Good, the woman said, though her tone suggested she would be watching carefully to ensure those promises were kept. And the others? One by one, the representatives of the galaxy's more aggressive civilizations began making similar commitments. Some spoke with genuine conviction, others with barely concealed terror, but all seemed to understand that the old ways of doing business were no longer viable. The crystalline collective began resonating with harmonics that the translation system rendered as something like relief mixed with joy. The Aquatic Federation's representatives were singing what could only be described as hymns of gratitude. Even the usually stoic nebula beings were cycling through colors that indicated profound emotional satisfaction. Marcus realized he was witnessing the end of one galactic age and the beginning of another. The question was whether this new age would be born through wisdom and choice, or through the kind of divine intervention that had reshaped civilizations in the distant past. The woman seemed to sense his thoughts. Change is coming, she said, addressing the entire assembly. The only question is whether it comes through evolution or revolution. The choice, as always, is yours. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Ambassador Zethkar slowly, painfully, pulled himself to his feet. His proud warrior bearing had been replaced by the careful movements of someone who suddenly understood exactly how fragile life could be. The sergeant. He is alive, he admitted, his voice barely audible. The woman's expression softened slightly, and Marcus caught a glimpse of the genuine relief that flickered across her features. For all her power and ancient authority, she was still fundamentally human in her concern for one of her descendants. Where? She asked simply. Detention Facility 7 in the Rigel system. Zethkar replied, each word dragged from him like a physical wound. He was being held for interrogation about human military capabilities. Ah. The single syllable carried volumes of meaning. You were trying to learn how dangerous we might become. A reasonable precaution given your imperial ambitions. She tilted her head thoughtfully. What did you discover? The Vorthan ambassador's throat sacs deflated completely. Nothing. He knew nothing about advanced human military assets. His knowledge was limited to standard patrol protocols and basic defensive systems. Of course it was, the woman said with something that might have been amusement. David Reynolds is exactly what he appears to be. A young soldier doing his duty, protecting civilians on a mining station. There were no secret weapons for him to reveal, no hidden battle fleets waiting in the void. She gestured toward Captain Marcus and the other human delegates. These people represent exactly what they claim to represent. A young species finding their way in a complex galaxy, trying to carve out a small place for themselves among the stars. Marcus felt a strange mixture of pride and confusion. If humanity truly descended from these ancient guardians, why were they struggling so much to establish themselves? Why did they seem so vulnerable compared to other galactic powers? As if reading his thoughts, the woman turned to address the human delegation directly. "You're wondering why you weren't told," she said, her voice gentle but carrying easily across the chamber. "Why you were allowed to struggle and scrape for every small victory when your heritage could have given you everything." Captain Marcus found his voice for the first time since this surreal encounter began. "Yes," he said simply. "Because earning something creates character in a way that inheritance never can," she replied. "My people could have awakened decades ago and handed you the galaxy on a silver platter. But what would that have taught you? What kind of civilization would you have become if you believed that power was your birthright, rather than your responsibility?" She walked closer to the human section, and Marcus felt that same strange recognition stirring in his chest. Something deep in his genetic memory was responding to her presence, acknowledging truths that his conscious mind had never been taught. Every struggle you've faced, every small victory you've earned, every compromise you've made to find peaceful solutions instead of violent ones, those experiences have shaped you into the people you are today, into the people we hoped you would become. The insectoid hive queen's chittering took on a different tone, one that the translation matrix rendered as something like curiosity mixed with desperate hope. "The younger races," she managed to articulate through her species' complex communication system. "If the old ones return, what happens to us?" The woman turned to address the entire assembly, her expression thoughtful. "That depends entirely on what you choose to do next," she said. "My people went to sleep because we believed the galaxy was ready to govern itself wisely. Recent events suggest we may have been premature in that assessment." She gestured around the chamber, taking in all the various species represented. "But we're not interested in ruling over you. We never were. We simply want to ensure that the strong protect the weak instead of preying upon them, that technological advancement serves the cause of life rather than death, and that the galaxy remains a place where any species can grow and thrive if they're willing to coexist peacefully with their neighbors." Ambassador Zethkar had been listening intently, and now he spoke with the careful precision of someone trying to negotiate for his civilization's survival. "What would you require of us? What changes must the Vorthan Empire make to avoid your intervention?" "Start by returning Sergeant Reynolds," the woman replied. "Unharmed and immediately. Follow that with genuine reparations for the mining station attack, not just monetary compensation, but acknowledgement of wrongdoing and concrete steps to ensure it never happens again." She paused, studying the Vorthan delegation with those ancient, knowing eyes. "Beyond that, you have a choice to make. You can continue on your current path of conquest and expansion, in which case you'll eventually encounter more of my people. Or you can choose to become the protectors your strength could make you instead of the predators you've chosen to be." "Protectors of what?" asked one of Zethkar's aides, a younger Vorthan whose scales still held the bright patterns of adolescence. "Of everyone weaker than you," came the simple reply. "Use your military might to stop pirates instead of enabling them. Use your advanced technology to help developing worlds instead of exploiting them. Use your influence in the galactic community to advocate for justice instead of personal gain." The concept seemed to genuinely perplex the Vorthan delegation. Marcus realized that their entire civilization was built around the idea that strength existed to dominate weakness. The notion of using power to protect rather than exploit was literally foreign to their thinking. "We would need to restructure our entire society," Zethkar said slowly, as if the implications were just beginning to dawn on him. "Yes," the woman agreed. "You would. It won't be easy and it won't happen overnight. But the alternative is to discover firsthand why so many aggressive civilizations have mysteriously vanished from galactic history. The threat was delivered in the same calm, conversational tone she had maintained throughout the encounter, but its impact on the assembled delegates was electric. Species that had been enemies for centuries suddenly found themselves looking at each other with new understanding. If humanity's guardians were truly awakening, the old rules of galactic politics were about to change dramatically. The Hive Queen's chittering became more frantic as ancient memories encoded in her species' genetic library began to surface. The Shapers, she whispered through the translation matrix. The Starwalkers, the ones who came before her, compound eyes fixed on the woman with a mixture of terror and reverence that was painful to witness. Captain Marcus felt his worldview crumbling and rebuilding itself with each word. The human colonies, Earth struggled to find its place among the stars. Their seemingly primitive technology compared to other species, it had all been an elaborate facade. Humanity wasn't the newcomer struggling to survive in a hostile galaxy. They were the descendants of its architects. The woman nodded acknowledgement to the Hive Queen before turning back to Ambassador Zethkar, who remained slumped in his chair like a broken puppet. "Your species has a proud warrior tradition," she said, her tone almost sympathetic. "I respect that, but you've forgotten the difference between strength and cruelty, between conquest and domination." She gestured toward the human delegation, where Marcus and his colleagues sat in stunned silence. "These are my children's children, countless generations removed from my time. They've forgotten who they truly are, just as we intended. We wanted them to find their own path, to grow into their potential naturally." The crystalline delegates from Andromeda began resonating again, their harmonic frequencies creating patterns that the translation systems couldn't interpret. But somehow, Marcus understood the meaning behind their crystalline song. They were singing lamentations for the dead, funeral dirges for civilizations that had been lost to time. "But you forced my hand," the woman continued, her attention returning to the cowering Vorthon ambassador. "When you took that young man, when you made him scream for help in the darkness of your prison ships, you crossed a line that has stood inviolate for 30 millennia. Ambassador Zethkar managed to find his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. What do you want from us?" "I want Sergeant Reynolds returned unharmed within the next standard day," she replied simply. "I want the Vorthon Empire to formally apologize to the human delegation for this unprovoked act of aggression. And I want reparations paid to the families of the 17 miners who died during your raid." The demand seemed almost reasonable given the circumstances. Marcus had expected threats of planetary annihilation or demands for unconditional surrender. Instead, this ancient being was asking for justice in the most civilized terms possible. "And if we refuse?" Zethkar asked, though they both knew he was grasping at straws. The woman's expression didn't change, but the air in the chamber suddenly felt thick and oppressive. Several of the atmospheric processors throughout the station began cycling frantically, as if struggling to maintain breathable conditions against some unseen force. 47 civilizations currently call this galaxy home," she said conversationally. "When my people first walked among the stars, there were thousands. Most of them fell to the same disease that seems to have infected your empire. The belief that might makes right, that the strong have the inherent right to prey upon the weak." She began walking again, her path taking her past each delegation in turn. As she passed, Marcus noticed that many of the alien representatives actually bowed their heads in submission, though whether from instinct or ancestral memory, he couldn't say. "We tried to guide them at first. We offered wisdom, shared technology, attempted to teach them better ways. But some species, like some individuals, can only learn through consequences." Her voice took on a note of genuine sadness. "So we became those consequences." The aquatic delegates' water began to bubble more violently, and Marcus realized they were hyperventilating through their gills. Even through their environmental suits, he could see the rapid movement of their respiratory systems as ancient fears overwhelmed their rational minds. "The Quarithian Empire controlled half the galaxy once," the woman continued. "They believed that other species existed solely to serve their needs. We disagreed. It took 3 of us exactly 14 standard days to dismantle their civilization completely." She paused beside the Nebula Collective's containment field, her reflection distorting strangely in the energy barrier. The Hegemon dynasty had technology that could crack planets like eggs. They used it frequently to enforce their will. We found their homeworld and showed them what their own weapons felt like when turned against them. Ambassador Zethkar was now visibly shaking, his reptilian scales rattling together like dried leaves in a storm. You destroyed entire civilizations? We ended tyrannies, she corrected firmly. We preserved every scrap of art, every piece of literature, every scientific discovery that had value. We relocated civilian populations to suitable worlds where they could start fresh without the poison of their old systems. But the structures of oppression, the military machines that existed solely to cause suffering, those we erased completely. Marcus found himself both horrified and fascinated by these revelations. The galaxy's ancient history, which had always been fragmentary and contradictory, suddenly made perfect sense. The mysterious disappearances of aggressive civilizations, the ruins found on dead worlds with no evidence of what had destroyed them, the persistent myths about vengeful gods that appeared whenever the strong oppressed the weak. It had all been the work of humanity's ancestors. So you see, the woman said, returning to stand before the Vorthan delegation, I'm not threatening you with anything new. I'm simply explaining how things have always worked in this galaxy. The strong are welcome to their strength, but they must use it responsibly. Those who choose otherwise discover that there is always someone stronger. The chamber's artificial gravity fluctuated again, and this time Marcus felt it in his bones. For just a moment, he had the terrifying sensation that the woman before them could reach out and adjust the fundamental forces of the universe as easily as turning a dial on a control panel. Ambassador Zethkar's throat sacs inflated and deflated rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation among his species. His clawed hands gripped the edge of the speaking platform so tightly that the metal began to bend under the pressure. I do not know what you speak of, human, he managed to say, though his voice carried none of its earlier authority. The woman tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. Sergeant David Reynolds, 26 years old, brown hair, green eyes. Last seen on the mining station at Proxima Centauri before your forces raided it 3 weeks ago. Her tone remained conversational, but something in her eyes made the temperature in the chamber seem to drop several degrees. Marcus felt his blood run cold. He knew David Reynolds. Every human in the delegation knew him. The young sergeant had been part of the security detail at humanity's newest mining operation. When the station had gone dark, Earth Command had assumed it was the equipment malfunction or pirate attack. They never suspected the Vorthans were involved. The Vorthan Empire does not engage in random raids on civilian targets, Zethkar declared, but his voice cracked slightly on the last word. Several of his aides-de-camp exchanged nervous glances behind their ambassador's back. The woman took a single step forward, just one step, but somehow it felt like she had closed the distance between them by miles. Don't lie to me, she said quietly. It makes me angry when people lie to me. The artificial gravity in the chamber seemed to fluctuate for a moment, causing several of the floating delegates to wobble uncertainly in their suspension fields. The crystalline beings from the Andromeda cluster began to resonate with a high-pitched whine that indicated extreme distress. And you really don't want to see me. Angry, Captain Marcus found himself leaning forward in his seat, completely captivated by the unfolding drama. The woman looked human, but there was something else about her. Something that spoke to a deeper part of his mind, awakening instincts he didn't know he possessed. Every fiber of his being was telling him that this person was important, that she was someone who should be listened to and obeyed without question. The hive queen of the insectoid collective suddenly began clicking rapidly, her antennae twitching with what could only be described as panic. Through the translation system, her words came out as a stream of terrified gibberish. Ancient protocols, forbidden knowledge, the old ones return. The Queen's outburst seemed to trigger something in the other delegates. The gaseous beings of the Nebula Collective began shifting through colors that had no names in any known language, while the aquatic representatives started producing harmonics that made the water in their environmental suits bubble frantically. What are you? Zethkar whispered, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. The woman smiled, and for the first time since entering the chamber, she looked almost friendly. I'm someone who has been asleep for a very long time. Someone who thought the universe had moved beyond the need for my kind of intervention. She paused, her expression growing serious again. I was wrong. She began walking slowly around the central platform, her footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent chamber. As she moved, Marcus noticed that some of the older delegates were actually backing away from their positions. pressing themselves against the walls as if trying to put as much distance as possible between themselves and this mysterious human. 30,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries, my people made a decision, the woman continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. We decided that the younger species deserved a chance to grow and develop without our interference. We went to sleep, confident that wisdom and compassion would eventually prevail over greed and violence. She stopped directly in front of the Vorthan delegation. We left guardians, of course, watchers to make sure that certain lines were never crossed. They were instructed to wake us only in the most extreme circumstances. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as pieces of an impossible puzzle began to fall into place. Ancient human myths suddenly seemed less like stories and more like half-remembered warnings. The woman before them wasn't just human. She was something far older and more dangerous than anything the galaxy had encountered in recorded history. Sergeant Reynolds called out when your soldiers dragged him from the mining station, she said, her voice never rising above that calm, conversational tone. He called for his mother, as young men often do when they're frightened. But he also called for something else, someone else. The chamber's environmental systems began to whine under some unseen strain. Several of the more sensitive species were now openly retreating toward the exits, though none seemed willing to actually leave the chamber entirely. He called for humanity's protectors, for the old guard, for us. She turned to face the assembled delegates, and Marcus saw something in her eyes that made his soul recognize truths his mind wasn't ready to accept. And we heard him. Ambassador Zethkar's legs gave out and he collapsed into his ceremonial chair with a crash that echoed through the chamber. The ancestors, he breathed. The first ones, but you're supposed to be extinct. Dead for millions of years. Not dead, the woman corrected gently. Just sleeping, waiting, hoping we would never be needed again. She spread her arms wide, encompassing the entire chamber. But here we are. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. Even the life support system seemed to hold their breath, as the galaxy's most powerful beings contemplated the implications of what they were witnessing. Humanity, the species they had dismissed as primitive newcomers, had guardians that predated galactic civilization itself. The Galactic Council chamber buzzed with the usual mix of clicks, growls, and electronic translations as representatives from 47 different species debated the latest trade agreements. Ambassador Zethkar of the Vorthan Empire adjusted his ceremonial armor plating, the metallic scales catching the artificial light as he spoke about mining rights in the Outer Rim territories. Captain Marcus Chen sat quietly in the human delegation section, his dark uniform a stark contrast to the colorful robes and exotic appearances surrounding him. Earth had only been part of the galactic community for 3 standard years, and humans were still considered newcomers by most species. Their small territory and relatively primitive technology meant they rarely spoke during these sessions. The Vorthans dominated this particular discussion. Their military might and advanced weaponry had earned them respect and fear throughout the galaxy. Zethkar's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. His species had conquered dozens of worlds, and their reputation for ruthlessness was well documented. The humans should understand their place in this matter, Zethkar declared, his reptilian features twisting into what passed for a smile among his kind. Their primitive mining techniques would only slow down our operations. We propose they surrender their claims to the Kepler 442 system in exchange for a modest compensation package. Several other delegates nodded in agreement. The insectoid hive queens chittered their approval while the gaseous nebula collective pulsed with supportive colors. It seemed like a foregone conclusion that humanity would once again be pushed aside by the more powerful species. Marcus remained silent, but his jaw tightened slightly. The Kepler 442 system contained some of the richest deposits of rare Earth elements that Earth had discovered since joining the galactic community. Losing those mining rights would set back human technological development by decades. But what could they do? Earth's small fleet of ships was no match for the Vorthan war machine. The debate continued for another hour, with various species offering token objections that everyone knew were merely for show. The Aquatic Federation made a half-hearted argument about environmental protection, while the Silicon-based collective raised concerns about mining quotas. But in the end, they all deferred to Vorthan authority. I believe this matter is settled, Zethkar announced, his clawed hand reaching for the ceremonial gavel that would make the decision official. The Kepler 442 system will be transferred to Vorthan control within the next lunar cycle. The chamber fell into an expectant hush. This was usually when the weaker species would formally surrender their claims and accept whatever scraps the powerful chose to throw their way. Marcus felt the weight of dozens of alien eyes upon him, waiting for humanity's inevitable capitulation. Just as Zethkar was about to bring down the gavel, the massive doors to the council chamber burst open. The sound echoed through the vast space like a gunshot, causing several species to jump in surprise. Guards at the entrance stepped back, their weapons lowering as if compelled by some unseen force. Through the doorway walked a figure that immediately commanded attention. She was human, but unlike any human most of the delegates had ever seen. Her hair was silver white despite her youthful appearance, and her eyes held a depth that seemed to contain the wisdom of ages. She wore simple black clothing that somehow managed to look more regal than the finest ceremonial robes in the chamber. Every conversation stopped. Every translator fell silent. Even the constant background hum of the chamber's life support system seemed to fade into nothing. The woman walked with purpose down the central aisle, her footsteps the only sound in the enormous room. The Vorthan guards moved to intercept her, but something in her gaze made them freeze in place. She passed them as if they were statues, never breaking stride or acknowledging their presence. Ambassador Zethkar's confident expression began to falter as she approached the central speaking platform. When she reached the center of the chamber, she turned to face the assembled delegates. Her voice when she spoke was calm and clear, carrying easily to every corner of the room without any technological amplification. "I came for him." Those 4 simple words hung in the air like a challenge. Every species represented in the chamber had their own concept of fear, and somehow this human woman had managed to trigger all of them simultaneously. The silence stretched on, broken only by the nervous shuffling of the insectoid delegates and the anxious color changes rippling through the nebula collective. Marcus felt his heart racing. Who was this woman, and why did her presence seem to terrify beings that had faced down entire fleets without flinching? He glanced around the chamber and saw his own confusion reflected in the faces of his fellow humans. They had no idea what was happening any more than he did. The woman's gaze swept across the assembled delegates before settling on Ambassador Zethkar. The Vorthan warrior who had faced down rebellion and conquest with equal courage actually took a step backward. His scales, which had been gleaming with confidence moments before, now seemed dull and brittle. "You took something that belongs to me," she continued, her voice never rising above a conversational tone. "I want him back." 6 months had passed since the transformation of galactic politics, and Earth's orbital shipyards had never been busier. But these weren't warships being constructed in the massive assembly bays. Instead, humanity was building hospital ships, research vessels, and mobile construction platforms designed to help developing worlds improve their infrastructure. Captain Marcus Chen stood in the observation deck of the newly commissioned Earth Alliance vessel Harmony, watching the final preparations for what would be humanity's first major peacekeeping mission. 3 Vorthan battlecruisers waited nearby, not as escorts, but as partners in a joint operation to protect a developing system from pirate raids. "Strange how quickly things can change," observed Admiral Sarah Martinez, the former Commander Walsh who had been promoted to oversee Earth's new role in galactic affairs. 6 months ago, the Vorthans were our biggest threat. Now they're asking us to teach them how to conduct humanitarian operations. Marcus nodded, still amazed by the transformation he had witnessed. The Vorthan Empire had embraced their new role as protectors with the same intensity they had once applied to conquest. Their ships now patrolled trade routes to prevent piracy. Their technology was being shared with worlds that needed defensive capabilities, and their military academies had completely restructured their curricula around peacekeeping operations. The Hive Queens sent another message, Admiral Martinez continued, handing him a data pad. "They want to establish a joint research station with us to study nonviolent conflict resolution. Apparently, their ancestral memories include fragments of techniques they learned from our predecessors." The Insectoid Collective had become one of humanity's strongest allies, their genetic memory providing valuable insights into the ancient methods used by humanity's guardians. Through their recollections, Earth's researchers were beginning to understand how their ancestors had managed to maintain galactic peace for millennia, without resorting to overwhelming force. "Any word from our mysterious benefactor?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "Nothing since that day in the council chamber," Martinez replied, "but there have been signs. Pirate fleets that were terrorizing the Outer Rim have been found drifting empty in space, their crews simply gone. A slave trading operation in the Vega system was discovered, with all their prisoners freed and their leadership suffering from what the medical reports describe as complete memory erasure." Marcus shivered slightly. The galaxy's new era of cooperation was being maintained through the carrot of improved relations and shared prosperity, but everyone knew the stick was still there, wielded by beings whose power defied comprehension. "The delegates want to meet with you before the mission launches," Martinez said, gesturing toward the ship's main conference room. "They're calling it a symbolic moment in galactic history." Marcus made his way to the conference room, where he found representatives from 15 different species waiting for him. Ambassador Zethkar was there, his ceremonial armor now bearing the symbols of the Galactic Peacekeeping Force rather than the Vorthan war machine. The Hive Queen had sent one of her daughters, whose translation matrix rendered her chittering as songs of hope and unity. "Captain Chen," Zethkar began, his voice carrying a humility that would have been unthinkable before his encounter with humanity's guardian. "We wanted to express our gratitude for humanity's leadership in this new age. Your species has shown us what it means to use strength in service of others." The Aquatic Federation's representative activated his suit's communication system. "The songs of the deep places speak of a time when the stars themselves sang with harmony," he bubbled through the translator. "We believe those times were lost to legend, but humanity has shown us that legends can become reality again." Marcus felt the weight of expectation in their words, but also something else: hope. For the first time since humanity had entered the galactic community, they were being looked to not as junior partners or potential threats, but as leaders and teachers. "We haven't done anything special," he said honestly. "We've just tried to be decent to each other and help where we could." "That is exactly why you are special," the young Vorthanaid said, her scales still showing the bright patterns of adolescence. "You had the power to demand tribute, to claim territory, to dominate others as your ancestors once did. Instead, you chose to serve." The meeting continued for another hour, with various delegates sharing reports of positive changes throughout their territories. Former enemies were working together on joint projects. Resources were being shared rather than hoarded. Even the most aggressive species were finding ways to channel their competitive instincts into constructive rather than destructive pursuits. As the delegates departed to return to their own ships, Marcus found himself alone with his thoughts. Through the viewport he could see Earth hanging in the distance, a blue marble that had somehow become the moral center of galactic civilization almost by accident. "You did well." Marcus spun around to find the woman standing behind him, looking exactly as she had 6 months ago. No aging, no change in her appearance, as if time itself bent around her presence. "You're real," he said, though he immediately felt foolish for stating the obvious. "As real as anything else in this universe," she replied with a slight smile. "I wanted to thank you personally before you departed on your mission. You and your people have exceeded our highest expectations." "We're just doing what seems right," Marcus said, echoing his words to the delegates. "Exactly," she agreed. "That's what makes you worthy successors. Not your power, not your technology, not your ancient heritage. Your instinct to do what's right even when it's difficult." She moved to stand beside him at the viewport, looking out at the bustling shipyards where dozens of species were working together on projects that would have been unthinkable a year ago. "Will you stay awake now?" Marcus asked. "Will your people take a more active role in galactic affairs?" "Some of us will remain vigilant," she said, "but our hope is that active intervention will become increasingly unnecessary. You've proven that the galaxy's younger races can learn to be better than their instincts. All they needed was the right example to follow." She turned to face him directly, and Marcus saw something in her ancient eyes that looked like pride mixed with deep affection. "Your mission to the Kepler system will be successful. The pirates threatening those worlds will withdraw rather than face a joint human-Vorthan peacekeeping force. But more importantly, the people you're protecting will remember what it feels like to be safe, and they'll pay it forward to others." "How can you be so certain?" Marcus asked, Because that's how change really happens, she replied, not through grand gestures or dramatic interventions, but through countless small acts of kindness and courage that spread from person to person, world to world, species to species. She began to fade, her form becoming translucent as she prepared to depart. The galaxy is in good hands, Captain. Your hands and the hands of all those who choose compassion over conquest. Wait, Marcus called out. Will we see you again? Her voice came from everywhere and nowhere as her form completed its disappearance. I hope not. But if you do, it will mean you've forgotten this lesson, and we'll have to teach it again. Marcus stood alone in the observation deck for several minutes after she vanished, processing the conversation and its implications. Then he activated his communicator. All hands prepare for departure. The Harmony launches in 30 minutes. As the ship undocked from the orbital station and joined its Vorthon escorts, Marcus felt a sense of rightness settle over him. Humanity had found its place in the galaxy not through conquest or domination, but through service and protection. They were no longer struggling newcomers begging for scraps from the galactic table. They were the conscience of civilization itself, carrying forward an ancient legacy of justice that would endure long after the last stars burned out. The galaxy would face new challenges in the years to come. There would be conflicts to resolve, disasters to respond to, and the eternal struggle between those who sought to build and those who sought to destroy. But for the first time in 30,000 years, Marcus was confident that the forces of creation would prevail. After all, they had guardians watching over them. And those guardians had taught them well.